Mariana Drummond left the Forum João Mendes with the posture of someone who delivered a defeat without drama. Her thin heel struck the marble of the corridor with an almost clinical precision, and those observing her from the outside, reporters, photographers, curious onlookers pushed against the iron fence, tried to read something in that impassive face. There were no tears. There was no trembling of the lips. There was no involuntary contraction of the chin that betrays most people in moments when the body insists on revealing what the mind tries to hide. There was only a 42-year-old woman crossing a revolving door as if she were leaving a routine meeting on some neutral floor of any corporate building. Judge Helio Cortez had ratified the divorce 40 minutes earlier, in a room with excessive air conditioning and that fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. The sentence was an insult disguised as legality. After 11 years of marriage to Renato Assunção, one of the heaviest names in the technology and infrastructure sector in São Paulo, Mariana received an amount that did not even cover a year of rent in the apartment she herself had decorated on Alameda Santos, choosing each piece with the care of someone who builds something intended to last. No right to participation in business assets, no access to the joint account that Renato had emptied months before, moving everything to offshore structures that his lawyer called, with a polite smile, a legitimate patrimonial reorganization. Renato sat beside Camila Seixas, 31 years old, daughter of a senator from São Paulo with straight hair and a champagne-colored blazer that cost more than the monthly salary of half the Forum employees. He did not look at Mariana. He looked at his watch as if that moment were a boring appointment between two other more important ones. This was the type of disrespect he practiced with excellence. Not the loud disrespect, which at least requires energy, but disrespect through indifference, which is much more corrosive because it offers nothing against which to react. Mariana's lawyer, a kind man named Dario Figueiredo, placed his hand on her shoulder as soon as they left the courtroom and said in a low voice that there was still an appeal, that they could question the valuation of the assets, that there were irregularities in the expert report that a second expert could easily contest. Mariana listened to everything without responding. Then, with a calmness that left Dario visibly disconcerted, she signed the ratification papers, folded the document carefully, returned the pen, and turned to leave. Renato was still in the corridor when she passed. He opened his mouth, a reflex of someone expecting a scene, an accusation, a contained cry that he could interpret as emotional instability for the benefit of any witness present. Mariana stopped. She looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds and said with a voice that neither rose nor fell in tone, "You are going to need this money much more than I will." Then she continued walking. Camila frowned. Renato's lawyer gave a quick smile, interpreting it as the wounded pride of a defeated woman. Renato laughed softly and said something about vanity to the assistant at his side. No one understood what Mariana had meant. That was exactly how it needed to be. Outside, the reporters tried to approach. A woman from the Poder e Dinheiro portal pushed a microphone toward her and asked if she had anything to say about the sentence. Another, from a variety show that existed at the intersection between journalism and entertainment without belonging completely to either, wanted to know if it was true that Mariana had refused the prenuptial agreement years before and if that had been a strategic error. Mariana did not answer any of the questions. She walked in a straight line, eyes ahead, until the sidewalk of Praça João Mendes, where the noise of downtown São Paulo imposed itself with the brutal democracy of traffic and commerce. The taxi that Dario had requested was waiting on the corner, but Mariana did not go to it. She crossed the street with measured steps, turned right toward Avenida Rangel Pestana, and walked for 2 blocks without looking to the sides. At a certain point, she took a small cell phone from the inner pocket of her bag, one with a simple screen, the type bought at used electronics stalls and not linked to any contract or registration, and read the message that had arrived. A single line. Black car. 3 minutes. The vehicle was parked in front of a newsstand whose headlines of the day were already displayed in laminated plastic. A Volvo with dark windows that did not match that part of downtown, but was also not flashy enough to draw attention. Just a car too expensive for the neighborhood, common enough for the kind of city São Paulo is. Mariana opened the back door and entered without hesitation. The man sitting on the beige leather seat was Hector Villarreal, 72 years old, founder of the Grupo Villarreal, a holding company with operations in logistics, technology, and renewable energy that had been Renato Asunción's greatest business adversary for the last 6 years. The two had waged a silent war over public contracts, infrastructure management software patents, and influence on ministry boards. The press never knew the real extent of the conflict because both sides had an interest in maintaining the appearance of civilized rivalry, the type of dispute that appears in business newspapers as healthy market competition and which underneath is much older and much more personal. Hector did not say good afternoon. He said, "You were perfect." Mariana leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, the first sign of tiredness she had let slip since morning. Not perfect, convincing. He agreed with a slight nod. The car was already moving along the avenue toward the highway access, with the discreet driver who did not look in the rear-view mirror. Neither of them knew that a freelance photographer, positioned by chance on the other side of the street to cover the divorce for a small celebrity portal, had captured the moment Mariana entered the Volvo. The image was still just a raw file on the camera's memory card. In 48 hours, it would be on every portal. But at that moment, as the car gained speed and downtown São Paulo was left behind like a set of fading noises, Mariana and Hector had time. She was the first to speak about what mattered. "The documents are safe." He nodded. "How many pages?" 237, plus the bank movement records that Renato's assistant sent me before resigning. Hector crossed his hands over his lap with the calmness of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations, who has learned over decades not to waste energy on reactions that the situation does not yet require. "Is it enough to open a formal investigation?" Mariana opened her eyes and looked at him with a precision that contrasted with the exhaustion on her face. "It is enough for much more than that." What she did not say at that moment, and what Hector did not yet know, was that the documents she held did not reveal only financial deviations and contractual irregularities. They revealed a pattern, a system, a way of operating that Renato had refined over years, not only in business but in relationships. And what this pattern revealed about their marriage, about Renato's previous marriage, and about other women who had passed through that man's life, was much darker than any contract or patent dispute could suggest. Mariana had not left the court defeated. She had left with the only thing that mattered, the freedom to act without anyone knowing she was acting. And as the Volvo crossed the overpass and São Paulo spread around like a massive and indifferent organism, she thought that 11 years was enough time to learn the difference between the moment to speak and the moment to wait. On that day, she was still waiting. But the silence had come to an end. The apartment was simple by the standards Mariana had known for 11 years. 40 square meters in Pinheiros, functional furniture chosen for neutrality rather than taste, a window overlooking an internal courtyard where a fig tree grew that no one had purposely planted. Hector had arranged everything with the discretion of someone who knew that appearances matter. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that seemed too temporary, nothing that would suggest instability to anyone looking from the outside. It was the kind of place where a person could disappear for a few months without anyone asking questions. She spent the first night without sleeping, not out of anxiety but by calculation. There was a fundamental difference between the two things, and Mariana had learned that difference in the hardest possible way over years in which anxiety had been the default state of existence, and calculation had been the only resource she had found to navigate it. She opened her laptop, connected the encrypted disk she had been carrying since before the hearing, and spent hours reorganizing the files in chronological order. Each folder had a neutral name. Each document was renamed with a numerical sequence. Anyone who opened that structure without the access key would see only random data. Mariana had learned that from the only person Renato never knew she knew. This person was named Fernanda Drummond. They were not related. The surname was a coincidence or perhaps destiny, depending on how one wanted to tell the story. Fernanda was 58 years old, with short-cut white hair, and a precision in speaking that came from decades working as a systems analyst in companies that handled large volumes of classified information. Over time, she had developed an extremely practical worldview regarding what should be recorded, how it should be kept, and how long a person should wait before using what they kept. They had met 3 years earlier, in a corporate management extension course at FGV, and the friendship had grown slowly, without fanfare, as anything that needs to last grows. It was Fernanda who taught Mariana to observe patterns before recording them, not to trust the cloud, to keep physical copies in separate places, never to use a personal cell phone for conversations that mattered. And it was also Fernanda who, on a rainy afternoon in the apartment in Pinheiros 3 months before the divorce, had said the phrase that Mariana had recorded with precision. The problem with those who are more intelligent than they believe they are is that they underestimate the intelligence of those who observe. The morning after the divorce, Mariana woke up at 6, drank sugarless coffee, and opened the news. The photo was there. A gossip portal had published it at 11 the previous night, with a title that mixed strangeness and insinuation. Renato Asunsão's ex-wife enters mysterious car after divorce hearing. The image was grainy but recognizable. Her from the back, hand on the Volvo's handle, the driver's face obscured by the angle and resolution. Hector did not appear. But the vehicle was traceable for anyone who knew how to look and had the motivation to do so. She called Hector. He had already seen it. "Change the car you are using, and do not show up here for now." He agreed without questioning. He was a man who had learned over many decades of business that the instructions of someone who thinks clearly should be followed for exactly that reason. Afterward, she called Dario, her lawyer, and said she was fine, that she had gone to a friend's house, that there was nothing to worry about. Dario wanted to know about the appeal. Mariana said she would think about it. It was not true, but it was the right answer for that moment, the answer that kept all doors open without revealing which one she intended to use. The true next step was in Campinas. She took a bus, not a taxi, not an app, nothing that would generate a record linked to her name or her card, and arrived in the city 3 hours later with the strange lightness of someone moving for the first time in a long time without needing to calculate what each step reveals. The address was that of a housing complex in the Cambuí neighborhood, ground floor, with a small garden and a gate painted blue, faded by years of sun. Before ringing the bell, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the window with the white lace curtain moving slightly because of an internal fan. There was an entire life behind that curtain that no one in São Paulo knew. The woman who opened the door was 54 years old, but seemed to carry more than that in the way she moved, as if each step were calculated not to waste energy in unnecessary directions. Brown hair with grey strands that were not hidden, a face with marked features that time had made more defined rather than less, eyes that evaluated before trusting, the type of look that is not hostile, but that demands you identify yourself before being received. Her name was Solange Borges, and to the official world, Solange Borges had left São Paulo 12 years earlier. After the end of a relationship the press never covered because Renato Asunsão was not yet famous enough at the time to justify coverage. What the press never knew was that Solange had been Renato's first wife. Not the girlfriend, not the partner, the wife in a small ceremony in Sorocaba, before the rise, before the public contracts, before the first business magazine cover. The marriage had been annulled in circumstances that Renato described on the rare occasions the subject arose as a youthful mistake on both sides. Solange had never spoken publicly, and there were very concrete reasons for this silence, reasons that had names and forms and practical consequences that she had learned to live around as if they were walls. Mariana entered. They sat in the small living room. There was a vase of orchids in the window and piles of accounting books on the coffee table. Solange worked as an independent consultant for small and medium-sized companies, the type of work that requires real competence and does not depend on public reputation. The hostess was direct, without the social preamble of someone making a visit. "Did you get the records?" Mariana placed the flash drive on the table. "Everything you described is there, and more." Solange did not smile. She kept looking at the small device as if it were physical proof of something she had waited to find for a long time and had learned over the years not to expect anymore. "He did to you the same thing he did to me," Solange said, not as a question, step by step. Mariana remained silent for a moment, letting the statement occupy the space it deserved. Almost identical. "The difference is that I had time to document it before he discarded me." Solange stood up, went to the kitchen, and returned with 2 glasses of water. They were automatic gestures from someone who needed movement to process information that was both new and completely predictable. "How much time do you have before he realizes the silence was strategic?" Mariana looked at her watch. "Less than we would like, but more than he imagines." What Solange revealed over the next 2 hours was not just the story of a failed marriage. It was the anatomy of a method. Renato identified women with specific attributes: access to influence networks, their own or inherited assets, professional credentials that opened doors he could not yet open alone. He approached with a calculated generosity that initially seemed genuine because it was consistent and detailed, the type of attention that intelligent people confuse with love because it is indistinguishable from the external form. He would marry, and then, gradually and systematically, he would begin to transfer everything of value, contacts, information, capital, reputation, to structures that he controlled alone. When the process was complete, he would initiate the withdrawal, preferably creating a context in which the woman appeared unstable or difficult, so that any subsequent complaint would be discredited before it went far enough to cause real damage. With Solange, it had worked almost perfectly. She had left the marriage confused, isolated, and with the reputation of a complicated woman that Renato had built with surgical patience over months before the end. It had taken her years to understand what had happened. When she understood, she no longer had enough evidence to sustain anything formally, and she had learned that the time that passes between the event and the recognition is exactly the time during which evidence dissolves. Mariana had arrived in time, or rather she had prepared in time. Before leaving, Solange said something that would echo during the bus ride back, while São Paulo reappeared on the horizon with its mixture of accidental beauty and functional brutality. He only functions when women are isolated. That is what he creates. Isolation. Mariana looked at her with an expression that was neither anger nor sadness. It was recognition, the specific type of recognition that happens when you find, in another person's words, the exact description of something you had felt but had not yet been able to fully name. Then that is exactly what we are going to undo. The photograph published by the portal the day before had generated more noise than Mariana expected. Not for the right reasons. Most of the comments revolved around speculation about a possible romance, about who the man in the car was, about whether she had immediately thrown herself into the arms of another right after the divorce. The simplest and most convenient narrative available. It was the type of story entertainment portals manufactured with ease, and that the public consumed without questioning, because it confirmed what people already believed about how women react to the end of relationships. Renato, she learned from Dario, had issued a note saying he wished his ex-wife all the peace and happiness she deserves. His lawyer, in a quick interview at the office door, described Mariana as a woman who is clearly still processing the transition. The language was careful. The effect was calculated. The implicit message was that she was acting emotionally and irrationally. She read it all without reacting and decided that it was, in fact, useful. As long as the press was occupied with romanticized or condescending versions of the story, no one would be looking for the real story, which was more complex and less cinematic than any entertainment portal could process in a timely manner. Hector had scheduled a meeting in a discreet office in Villa Olympia, owned by a consulting firm he used as an intermediary structure for meetings that did not need an institutional trail. Mariana arrived by subway, entered through the side access Hector had described in a short message, and went up to the 3rd floor via a staircase that smelled of new paint. The room was functional, with a round table, dark leather chairs, and a window with closed blinds that prevented light and external gazes from entering. There was another person there besides Hector, a woman of about 45, short black hair that was the only visible part of a deliberately contained aesthetic, thin-rimmed glasses, an expression that revealed nothing before it was necessary. Hector introduced her as Beatriz Tanaka, legal director of the Grupo Villarreal for 12 years. Mariana had imagined someone existed in this role, but she had not prepared for the level of preparedness Beatriz demonstrated in the first 2 minutes of conversation. She had already analyzed a copy of the documents Mariana had sent via a secure channel the previous night, and had a list of notes printed on paper that carried neither a header nor a company logo, the type of precaution that reveals familiarity with situations where the document itself can become evidence. "We have enough material to file a complaint on 3 distinct fronts," Beatrice said without preamble. "Irregularities in the asset valuation reports used in the divorce process, which invalidates the sentence. Signs of undeclared financial movement to offshore structures, which opens a parallel investigation of a different nature. And a set of corporate contracts with language that signals, quite clearly, the use of privileged information obtained through improper access to third-party data." She paused. "This last part is the most sensitive, because part of the material was collected within a marital relationship, which generates questions about admissibility that we need to address before any move." Mariana tilted her head slightly. "I know. That is why there are also testimonies, not just documents." Beatrice crossed her arms. "How many people?" "So far 2 confirmed. Me and another woman who preferred not to be identified yet. But there are more. I am in the process of locating them and creating the context in which speaking is a real possibility for each of them." Hector, who had remained silent while the 2 spoke for the first time since the introductions. "The problem with a premature complaint is that Renato will activate the best lawyers in the country and turn this into a circus of discredit before the process even begins. He has relationships with people who control agendas in at least 3 major outlets. Mariana knew that better than he did. She had watched from the inside how Renato managed the press, not through direct pressure which leaves trails and generates resistance, but through favors, access, strategically allocated advertisements, invitations to events where journalists became, without realizing it, part of the network that would be impossible for them to cover independently afterward. "Then the complaint cannot be premature," Mariana said. "It needs to be definitive. When it comes out, it needs to come out with everything at once, so that he does not have time to assemble the narrative before the public has already formed its own. The difference between an accusation he can reverse and one he cannot is not the content, it is the timing." The 3 remained silent for a moment. It was a high-risk strategy because it required control of variables that could not be fully controlled. But it was also the only one that would work against someone who mastered the image game with Renato Asunção's competence. It was Beatriz who asked the question that needed to be asked. "You mentioned other women. Do you believe they will want to speak?" Mariana thought of Solange, sitting in the small room in Campinas with the orchid vase in the window, and the eyes that evaluated before trusting. She thought of the time it had taken for Solange to even be able to name what had happened to her, let alone describe it to another person. "I don't know, but I know some of them are waiting for a reason to speak. They just need to know they won't be speaking alone." Beatrice made a note. Hector observed the 2 women and had the feeling, which rarely visited him after decades in the business world, of watching something that had begun long before he entered the story and would continue long after his specific role in it ended. He had sought Mariana 6 months earlier because he saw in her a strategic ally in a corporate dispute with Renato that had lasted for years. What he had not anticipated was that what she carried was much larger than any dispute over a contract or market share. When the meeting ended and Mariana was descending the stairs, Beatriz caught up to her on the 2nd floor. She spoke in a low voice, aware that walls have resonance. "I need you to know that what you are doing has a level of personal risk that perhaps you are still underestimating. Renato Asunção has a lot to lose and will act accordingly, not impulsively, methodically, which is much more dangerous." Mariana stopped on the stairs and turned to her with an expression that was, at the same time, tired and absolutely firm, like 2 qualities that do not exclude each other but rarely appear together. "I know exactly what he does when he feels he is losing control. I spent 11 years observing." She stepped down the last stair. "That is exactly why I know what is going to happen next." Beatrice stood looking at the empty corridor for a moment after Mariana left. Then she returned to the room, where Hector was still sitting looking at the table with the expression of someone recalibrating previous evaluations. "This woman," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, was not fleeing that court. Beatrice took off her glasses and cleaned the lens with a handkerchief in a gesture that was both habit and time to think. No. She was arriving. The first leak was small, purposely small, a note in a specialized economics blog without a signature, describing atypical financial movements in two companies linked to Renato Asunção's group in the months preceding the divorce. The text was technical, dense, the kind most people skim over, because it offers no easy narrative to hold attention. But for those who knew what to look for, auditors, investigative journalists, sector analysts, it was a precise lead. Mariana had spent 3 weeks building what she and Beatrice called, privately, the sequence. It was not an attack. It was a series of calibrated stimuli, each designed to produce a specific reaction in Renato, and each reaction would leave a trail that would add to the next. The principle was simple, though the execution was not. The more Renato tried to defend himself publicly, the more evidence he would produce that there was something to hide. Silence would be interpreted as guilt. Her response would be interpreted as confirmation that the topic deserved attention. It was a trap built with the precise understanding of how he thought. The note in the blog generated exactly what they expected. Within 48 hours, Renato's press officer published a note calling the text groundless speculation produced by ill-intentioned sources with a clear agenda. The note was technically correct on some superficial points, which was much worse than if it were completely false, because it signaled that Renato had read it carefully and was choosing carefully what to refute, which in turn signaled there were things he could not refute. Beatrice underlined this passage in red on the printout she had made of the note. The second piece of the sequence was more delicate because it involved a person. It involved a woman named Patricia Alencar, 48 years old, former director of operations for one of Renato's group companies, who had resigned 3 years earlier in circumstances that were never publicly explained and which, for anyone paying attention to the details of the corporate announcement, were visibly strange. Mariana had reached her through a network of professional contacts that Fernanda Drummond had helped map with the methodical patience of someone who understands that human connections are the hardest information to falsify. Patricia had not been married to Renato, but had had a relationship with him for 2 years before being progressively sidelined from decisions that were previously part of her role. She lived in Florianopolis, had a solid executive coaching practice, and had signed, upon leaving the company, a confidentiality agreement drafted so broadly that, in practice, it seemed to forbid her from speaking about anything that had happened during the years she worked there. The first conversation between Mariana and Patricia happened via video call, with Beatrice present but off camera taking notes. Patricia was cautious at first, responding with short sentences and long pauses that were not hesitation but evaluation. She was deciding with each answer how far she was willing to go. But there was something in how Mariana described her own experience, not in search of solidarity or emotional validation, but with the objective precision of someone documenting facts for a specific purpose, that made Patricia lower her guard slightly, not because she felt empathy, but because she recognized integrity. At the end of the first hour, she said she wanted to consult a lawyer before any formal commitment. Beatrice provided 2 trusted names in Santa Catarina. Meanwhile, Solange had agreed to formalize a testimony, not public yet, just recorded in a document, dated, notarized, available for use at the appropriate time. It had been Fernanda who convinced her, in a direct 40-minute call, that Mariana purposely did not participate in, because she understood that Solange needed to feel the decision was hers, not an invitation from someone with a direct interest in the outcome. The distinction mattered more than any rational argument. Renato, meanwhile, was reacting in ways that followed a pattern Mariana had predicted, with almost uncomfortable precision. He had hired a digital reputation monitoring company that tracked mentions of his name in real time across all portals and social networks. He had instructed his assistant to catalogue any contact Mariana made with people in his professional or personal circle. And he had tried, through an intermediary who reached Dario Figueiredo indirectly enough to be technically deniable, to propose a new financial settlement, significantly more generous than the value of the ratified sentence, with the exact amount suggesting someone had calculated what would be necessary to seem attractive, provided Mariana signed a silence document more comprehensive than anything discussed during the process. Dario had passed the proposal to Mariana with a certain discomfort that was professional rather than personal, making it absolutely clear that the decision was hers and that he had no opinion on which decision would be right. She remained silent for a few seconds, not to think but to let the silence do its work before responding. "Tell them I am considering it." It was a lie, but it was the right answer. The fact that Renato had made that offer at that moment confirmed he was worried about something specific and immediate, and that this specific something was worth, to him, much more than the proposed value, which in turn confirmed there was more to be revealed than he had been able to anticipate. The third piece of the sequence was the one that broke the balance definitively and irreversibly. An investigative journalist from the Agência Pública Portal, named Camille Rocha, had been contacted anonymously with a set of documents pointing to specific and verifiable inconsistencies in an infrastructure concession contract involving Renato's group and a state public body. The story took 3 weeks to be investigated and verified completely independently, with consultations with experts who had no relationship with the parties involved. When it came out, it was grounded, signed with the journalist's full name, and cited only documents obtained by the report as its source. The most solid formulation possible, the one that offers the least surface for contestation. Renato read it on a Monday morning, and according to what Mariana learned from a source inside his office who had decided, for their own reasons, to maintain a discreet channel of information, ordered the cancellation of all meetings for the day. That same day, Camille Rocha received a new message from her anonymous source. This time the documents were more detailed and more specific, and there was, attached to the material, an invitation for an in-person conversation with a person the source described only as someone who lived from the inside what the documents described from the outside. Camille accepted. Mariana spent the night before the meeting rereading, for the last time, the notes she had written over months in a physical notebook, with blue ink pen, because paper has no digital vulnerabilities. Dates, values, names in code that she would know how to decode, but that would be illegible to anyone else. Behavioral patterns described with the neutral language of one who observes without immediate judgment. There was no anger in those pages. There was method. And there was also, in some paragraphs written at late hours when fatigue lowered her guard, a coldness that she herself thought was not natural, but that she had learned as absolutely necessary. Anger was too expensive. It cost clarity, and clarity was the only resource that, at that moment, she could not afford to waste. The next morning, Mariana entered a cafe in Itambibi, where the noise was sufficient to make private conversations practically inaudible to neighboring tables, and sat across from a woman with an open notebook and a pen in hand, the signal agreed upon in advance. The two did not greet each other with much warmth. There was a mutual professionalism that dispensed with ceremony and was, in fact, more respectful than any effusion would have been. Camille said, "Before we begin, I want you to know that nothing you tell me will go public without independent verification and without me having tried to obtain a response from the other party. I do not work with a single version of any story." Mariana said, "I know. That is exactly why I chose you." She began to speak, and for the first time since she had left the court in silence weeks before, she did not choose words for the effect they would cause. She did not measure what she revealed by the calculated impact. She did not manage the narrative for a specific result. She chose by the precision of what was true, and let the truth be the enough that it is when it finally has space to sit down. Camille Rocha's story did not come out immediately. It went through 3 rounds of internal editing, legal verification, and consultation with external specialists who were not usually consulted by the newsroom but were precisely the profiles needed for that type of material. Mariana had anticipated it would take time and had used the waiting period to complete the hardest part of what she and Beatrice had planned, convincing Patricia Alencar. Patricia, after 2 weeks consulting her lawyer in Florianopolis, had concluded that the confidentiality agreement she had signed upon leaving Renato's company was not as impermeable as it seemed, especially if what she had witnessed involved conduct that went beyond the commercial disputes the document intended to protect. Her lawyer had identified a specific and well-founded loophole. The document explicitly forbade speaking about the company's business strategies, internal processes, and client information. But it contained no clause covering descriptions of the executive's personal conduct that directly affected the work environment and the people working in it. It was a technical distinction that, in the hands of a competent lawyer, opened enough space for what needed to happen. Patricia recorded her testimony on video in a neutral office in Florianopolis that her lawyer had reserved for the occasion, with a fixed camera on a tripod and the lawyer present throughout the process. She did not cry. She spoke with the contained objectivity of someone who had processed it over years and had finally reached a point where the words weighed no more than the facts they described. A point that is not indifference, but is the most efficient form of clarity available when anger has already done its work and can be dispensed with. She described how the relationship had begun with a power imbalance that she had chosen to ignore because ignoring it was more convenient than recognizing it. How Renato had used information she shared in confidence to make corporate decisions that progressively excluded her from spaces that were hers by merit, and how her departure from the company had been preceded by a subtle campaign of isolation within the team that had taken months and was invisible to those who did not know what to observe. The testimony lasted 42 minutes. Beatrice received the file and stored it with the others in a structure that mirrored what Mariana had used for her own documents. There was a fourth woman Mariana had located, and who had not yet decided to participate. Her name was Vera Esteves, 52 years old, a tax lawyer in Brasilia with an established and respected practice, who had had a relationship with Renato during a period when he was expanding the group's operations to the Distrito Federal, and needed someone who understood the specific fiscal structure of that environment. The relationship had ended abruptly, with an explanation Renato had given via message. A single short and definitive message that Vera had reread for months, trying to find something that was not there. She had spent years without speaking about it to almost anyone. Mariana had contacted her through a mutual friend who did not know exactly what it was about, only that Mariana wanted to talk about something concerning a specific period of Vera's life. Vera responded with a single message written with the precision of someone choosing each word as a lawyer before sending, "I know why you are contacting me. I am not ready, but I am not ruling it out." Mariana saved that message and did not insist. It was the right answer. Not the silence that closes doors, but the silence that keeps the possibility open. It was the kind of respect that the entire process demanded. Meanwhile, Renato's behavior had changed pace in ways that were detectable to those who knew what to observe. The press officer's notes became less frequent and more careful in vocabulary, which was a clear sign that the legal department had taken control of communication and was reviewing everything before release. He had cancelled public appearances that were confirmed on his schedule, including a lecture at a technology event for which he had sent confirmation of attendance, and an interview for a business magazine scheduled weeks before. Camila Seixas had posted less on social media, and the few posts were images of neutral places, without Renato in the frame, without mention of him, the kind of absence that is itself a presence to those who pay attention. Hector observed all this from a calculated distance, compiling information through sources within the sector he had maintained for years as part of the group's competitive intelligence. On a Thursday afternoon, he called Mariana with information that was not in the script, and that slightly changed the time calculations. Renato hired a private investigation firm specializing in monitoring individuals. They are trying to systematically map your recent contacts. Mariana processed that for a second. How long until they reach Solange? Hard to know precisely. Solange has no visible digital connection to you, but if the firm is competent, they can get there by elimination and cross-referencing third-party data. Mariana thanked him and hung up. She called Solange immediately, not letting more than 2 minutes pass. There may be someone asking questions about you soon. You don't need to run. You don't need to change anything visible. But you need to know so as not to be surprised. Solange remained silent for a moment that was not surprise but reflection. I know how to deal with that. There was a firmness in her voice that Mariana recognized as something built when the alternative to being firm is collapsing, and which is therefore much more solid than any firmness that comes from never having been tested. I learned how to not exist when I don't want to be found. 12 years are enough time to learn that properly. The story came out on a Friday at 7 in the morning, a time chosen with precise intent. Before the start of the press office's workday, when crisis response protocols were still being activated, but after the nightly traffic peak, so that readers arriving at the platform in the morning would find the text already stabilized at the top of the page. The title was direct, without sensationalism. Documents reveal irregular movement in Grupo Asuncion contracts. The text did not mention Mariana. It did not mention divorce. There was nothing that sounded like personal revenge, or that could be dismissed as a settlement of scores between ex-spouses. It was a journalistic piece built on verified documents, public data cross-referenced with internal records, and analysis by independent experts whose resumes and credentials were described in detail. Camille had done exactly what she said she would do, and she had done it well. In 2 hours, the text had been republished by 3 outlets with greater reach. In 4 hours, there was a statement from a state control body saying the news would be investigated with the seriousness it deserves, the bureaucratic language that, in that specific context, was more significant than any more dramatic declaration. In 6 hours, Renato's press officer had issued a note calling the text a work of fiction commissioned by business adversaries with clear interests in weakening the group, which was a serious strategic error, because it opened the door for Camille to publish, the next day, the complete investigation methodology, including the names and affiliations of the experts consulted, the list of verified documents, and the process by which each piece of information had been independently checked. Beatrice read the officer's note and said on the phone, with a neutrality that only disguised satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone seeing a prediction confirmed with precision. He just turned an economic story into a matter of public credibility. Very helpful of him. Mariana responded with a silence that was agreement. Mariana was in Pinheiros when the notifications began to arrive with an increasing frequency. Sitting in the chair by the window overlooking the courtyard and the spontaneous fig tree, she looked at the cell phone screen without the urgency someone from outside would expect, without the type of performative satisfaction people associate with turning points. She had spent months building that moment with precision and care. Now that it had arrived, what she felt was not euphoria. It was something more like recognition, the quiet confirmation that what she had planned was working the way she had planned it, and that this confirmation was enough. But she also knew that was only the visible beginning of a process that still had a long way to go and that the next steps would be the most demanding of all. Renato Asuncion spent the weekend in closed meetings with his legal team at a law firm in Jardins that he had hired specifically for high-exposure crisis management. On Monday, his office filed a request for the right of reply with the portal that published Camille's story, accompanied by an extrajudicial notification accusing the journalist of defamation with the intent to cause quantified proprietary damage in a specific amount. It was the move Beatrice had anticipated, and it was also the move they expected, not because it was an obvious mistake, but because it was the only one available for someone who wanted to react without admitting there was something to hide. The notification generated an obligation for a public response, and the response this time would not come only from verified documents. Patricia Alencar was the first to speak in a forum that could not be ignored. Not in an interview for the press, not in a social media post, in a formal testimony filed with a business mediation body, with a copy sent simultaneously to the specialized press and the control body that had opened the inquiry. The text was sober, precise and effective to the exact extent that it remained entirely within verifiable facts, without dramatization and without language that could be characterized as a personal attack. It described, with the objectivity of one who knows the difference between what one feels and what one can demonstrate, how the conduct of an executive in a leadership position had systematically created a manipulative work environment and how the termination of the employment link had been instrumentalized to protect him from any questioning regarding that conduct. Renato's name did not appear directly in the document, but the position, the period, the company, and the location were all there with sufficient precision. For anyone who knew what to look for, the correspondence was direct and unequivocal. The reaction from Renato's side was silence, not because he was calm or because he had reached any peace with the situation, but because his lawyers had realized that each public response generated more coverage, and more coverage meant more readers building, in real time, a narrative that he did not control, and that became more cohesive with each new element that entered. It was the trap Mariana had described to Beatriz weeks before, with a precision that had seemed almost theoretical at that moment. Renato only functioned when he dominated the environment. In an environment he did not control, he tended to paralyze, and this paralysis, which looked like restraint, was read by any external observer as confirmation. But the paralysis had an internal cost that was not visible from the outside. Within the group, the board members were pressing for a response that was at once convincing and safe, an impossible combination under the circumstances. Business partners began asking for extraordinary meetings to discuss what they called institutional exposure. A foreign company that had initiated advanced negotiations for a joint venture with the group had sent a formal email requesting a meeting to, in the careful language of international corporatism, align understanding regarding recent developments in the press, which meant for anyone who read it correctly that they were actively reconsidering. Mariana learned part of this through Hector, and the rest she inferred with the precision of someone who spent 11 years learning to read the behavior of a specific person in situations of growing pressure. There was a characteristic moment in Renato's pressure cycle. She had observed it in corporate disputes, in difficult negotiations, in conflicts with board members, when he would make a rash decision, moved by the unbearable feeling that he needed to regain control before the scenario consolidated without him. She was waiting for that moment, with the patience of one who knows it always arrives. It arrived on a Wednesday night. Renato granted a live interview to a business program on broadcast television during prime time. It was not the format any competent advisor would have chosen for that situation. Too unpredictable, too live, too dependent on the ability to improvise without revealing. But he had insisted, convinced that his physical presence, his eloquence, and his ability to project security would be enough to invert the perception that was forming. The interviewer was an experienced journalist who had done her homework rigorously. In the first 10 minutes, he navigated reasonably well through technical questions about the contracts, using language vague enough not to commit to anything verifiable. But when she raised the issue of external testimonies that had surfaced in the specialized press, he made an error that Mariana, watching live in the apartment in Pinheiros, with the volume low so as not to disturb her concentration, recognized immediately for what it was. He mentioned, almost in passing, and as if it were a secondary detail, that he had been the target of a scheme orchestrated by people with a clear interest in destabilizing the group at a moment of growth. It was a phrase calculated to suggest conspirators without naming anyone specific, the type of statement that leaves an impression without offering anything verifiable. But the word scheme drew immediate attention and directed the conversation exactly where he did not want it. In the live comments accompanying the digital platform's broadcast, hundreds of people immediately began asking who these people were, what interests were involved, why there were no names. The interviewer, who had perceived the opening before he finished the sentence, asked with professional calmness if he had evidence of this alleged scheme that he could share with the public. Renato retreated, used progressively vaguer language, and the interview ended with a televised image of a man who had entered the studio to recover the narrative and had left having revealed, without realizing it, that there was something he could not say directly. That night, Vera Esteves called Mariana. Without preamble, without the cautious distance of previous communications, she said only, "I saw the interview." A pause of a few seconds. "I am ready." Mariana closed her eyes for a second. "Are you sure?" "I am. Not because I want to, let that be clear, but because if I stay silent now, later it will be harder for me to understand why I did." It was a logic Mariana understood completely, not only rationally, but viscerally. When you want to start, tell me what you need to feel safe at each stage of the process. I already know what I need. I need my testimony to be the last one presented. That when I speak, the picture is already almost complete, and what I say is the element that closes it, not the one that opens it. You can count on that. After she hung up, Mariana stood looking at the window for a time she did not measure. The courtyard below was empty at that hour, with a single lamp illuminating the corner of a small garden where the spontaneous fig tree cast an irregular shadow on the wall. She thought about how those four women, she, Solange, Patricia, and Vera, had reached that point through completely different paths at different moments in life, with experiences that touched at specific points without ever having crossed before. And how, despite all that difference, there was something deeply common in each one's trajectory that went far beyond Renato. There was the moment each of them had understood what was happening to her and had chosen, for reasons that were hers and no one else's, to remain silent. Not out of weakness, not out of cowardice, for lack of a context that made silence unnecessary, that made it possible to speak without paying a price. There was no reason to pay alone. That context now existed. They had built it, and it was solid enough to sustain what needed to come next. Mariana's testimony to the formal investigation took place in a meeting room of a public body in downtown São Paulo on a rainy Tuesday morning when the city had that greyish tone that is its version of winter. She arrived with Beatrice and the specific lawyer they had hired for that phase of the process, a specialist in corporate law with experience in administrative investigations who had reviewed every page of the documents and knew exactly what could be said and in what sequence. Renato had been formally notified 5 days before the date. His lawyer had tried, until the eve, to postpone the date, alleging a need for additional time for technical analysis of the documents presented. The request had been denied with language that left no room for a new attempt. Mariana had spent the previous days rereading her notes for the last time, then closing them in the notebook and putting the notebook in a drawer. Not because she would forget them. They were 11 years of observation that needed no review, because they had been recorded with the precision of one who knew that moment would arrive. But because putting those pages away before entering the room was a deliberate act of closing a phase. She would enter that room only with what she knew by heart, without paper as a crutch, without the comfort of having everything written available, because the clarity she needed to project was the clarity of someone who does not need to consult notes to know what is true. The investigator who would conduct the testimony was a methodical man who appeared to be in his 50s, with a black-covered notebook and the patient and deliberately neutral air of someone who had already heard many versions of many stories and had learned that the investigator's reaction interferes with the quality of what is heard. He began with the formal questions necessary for the record: full name, qualifications, period of cohabitation with the investigated, specific nature of the access she had had to information from the business group during the marriage. Mariana answered everything with precision and without drama, with the same objectivity she had practiced over months of preparation. Then came the questions about the documents, how she had first identified the irregularities, in what circumstances she had begun to copy the files, for what specific reason she had waited until the moment of the divorce to forward the material to the competent authorities instead of doing it before. The investigator expressed no judgment at any moment. He asked questions with the regularity of one who follows a method and took notes with an attention that was the only visible form of interest available in that format. The session lasted 4 hours with a 20-minute break, and when the formal part ended, there was in the record something much more complete and more solid than any public declaration could have built. At the end, when the formal questions were closed and the investigator had made the gesture of conclusion, Mariana asked for the floor to add an element that had not been asked directly, but that she considered relevant for the complete understanding of what was being investigated. The investigator looked at her for a moment and agreed with a nod. Beatrice, on the other side of the table, remained absolutely still with the restraint of one who knows that what is about to happen is the most important moment of everything that was built. Mariana placed a sealed envelope on the table. Inside was a printed copy of the messages she had kept separately from all other documents for months, the messages she had found in a folder of internal communications, almost by chance, looking for something else. The detailed record of a strategy planned by Renato together with his lawyer of decades, referring to the period of Solange, describing with an administrative coldness the steps to create isolation, discredit reputation, and instrumentalize the termination of the marriage in order to minimize any risk of subsequent questioning. "This is not about me," she said, with a calmness that was the product of much work and that had cost what it needed to cost. "This is about what happens before I enter the story. And what this shows is that what I lived was not the first occurrence of something. It was the documented continuation of a method that existed before me and that had been deliberately planned." She paused for a second, letting the investigator process. "I thought it was relevant for the complete understanding of the pattern being investigated." The investigator looked at the envelope for a long moment before picking it up with both hands. Then he said, with the precise economy of words of someone choosing each one with awareness of what the formal record means, "Thank you for the completeness of the testimony." Mariana left the room with Beatrice and said nothing until they reached the elevator in the corridor. When the doors closed, Beatrice spoke first, with a voice lower than the space required. "You saved that for the testimony." It was not a question. It was recognition. Mariana stood looking at the floor panel with the numbers that lit up and went out. If I had delivered that before in any other context, it could look like the most dramatic point of a personal story, something that serves a narrative and not an investigation. Here, in a formal testimony recorded in an official process, it is evidence. The difference is not in the content, it is in the context in which the content exists. Beatrice was quiet for a second that was more than silence. "It is an important distinction." "It is the only distinction that mattered," Mariana said, and the elevator opened on the ground floor. Outside, the rain had stopped completely during the 4 hours they had spent inside. São Paulo had that specific luminosity of days that start closed and open in the middle of the afternoon, when light passes through the steam still present in the air, and everything seems slightly unreal, slightly sharper than usual. They walked 2 blocks without speaking, each processing what had happened at her own pace. Then Beatrice asked what she was going to do now, the simplest and hardest question available at that moment. Mariana thought for a moment that was not hesitation. Today, nothing. Tomorrow, too. Let the process be what it is, without trying to direct what no longer needs direction. And after? Mariana looked at the busy avenue, at the cars, at the people passing with the specific indifference of those who have their own worlds to manage. After, I will think about how to use what I learned, but in a different way this time. She did not explain what she meant at that moment. Beatrice did not ask. There was something in the way Mariana was walking, not with the calculated rigidity of the previous months, not with the restraint of someone holding something heavy, but with a looseness that seemed new and was genuine, precisely because it had not been planned. That dispensed with any explanation for now. 3 weeks later, the investigation formally expanded its scope beyond what had been initially declared. The testimonies of Patricia, Solange, and Vera had been incorporated as complementary material with each one's formal consent, and with all the procedural documentation that guaranteed its admissibility. The messages Mariana had presented at the end of her testimony had led to an analysis of the history of Renato's lawyer's practice that revealed, with a regularity that was no coincidence, a pattern of guidance in situations with a similar structure involving at least 2 other clients over years. The case had ceased to be an administrative process about contractual irregularity and had transformed into something much broader and much more structural than any of the individual pieces would have suggested alone. Renato Assunção presented himself to the investigation, accompanied by 4 lawyers, in a formation that was itself a communication about the state of affairs. He did not answer any questions directly or substantively, invoking in all answers the right not to produce evidence against himself, the behavior of someone who had received precise guidance that anything said in that context would be used against him, and that the only remaining strategy was not to provide more material than what was already recorded. The group's board removed him from the executive presidency provisionally while the investigation was underway, with an official note that used the words "corporate governance measure" in compliance with the best practices of the sector. Camille Rocha published a second story describing the removal and its context, and in the comments, There were hundreds of people who had followed the process since the first news, and who now built, collectively and without coordination, a public understanding of what had happened that was more complete and more precise than any version any press office could have fabricated. Mariana did not read the comments. She was in Campinas, sitting in Solange's small living room, with the orchid vase in the window and 2 cups of coffee on the coffee table, where months earlier a flash drive had been placed that had changed the course of many things. The two did not talk about the process, about the investigation, about the developments that continued to happen. They talked about other things, about the years each had spent without fully understanding what she had lived, about the exact point where understanding had arrived and what had changed after that, about what remains when silence finally ends and what is discovered that existed beneath it. It was a conversation that had no urgency, no agenda, did not need to reach any specific place before a determined time. It was just 2 women who had traveled very long paths by completely different routes to reach the same point of understanding, and who could finally sit and talk as if they had all the time in the world. Because for the first time in a long time they did. 6 months later, Mariana Drummond was sitting in an auditorium at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas with 30 other people around, in a space with that specific acoustics of rooms designed for listening. The lecture had ended 20 minutes ago, but the discussion had taken a life of its own and continued with the energy of conversations that reach something real. It was a seminar on reputational risk management in corporate structures, and the person speaking at that moment was a professor of business ethics who had used the case of the Grupo Assunção as a detailed case study, without naming the people involved directly, only the structures, the mechanisms, and the dynamics the case had revealed exceptionally clearly. Mariana had arrived as a listener, without announcing her presence, without an agenda, beyond a genuine interest in the topic. But the professor had recognized her during the break and asked, with the care of one who does not want to create an obligation, if she would be willing to add some perspective from the position she had occupied. Mariana had said she would think about it during the remainder of the lecture. When the discussion opened to the floor, she raised her hand. She did not identify herself by name. It was not necessary for what she wanted to say. She said only that she had followed very closely a case with structural characteristics similar to what was being analyzed, and that there was an element that rarely entered academic and professional debates about corporate governance failures: the role of silence. Not silence as an absence of information, not silence as ignorance of what is happening, but silence as a conscious strategy, both for the one who practices the conduct and the one who suffers it and learns, through concrete experience, that speaking has a cost for which there is no safe context to pay. What documents rarely capture, she said with the clarity that came from having lived it, is the process by which someone who has something important to say decides there is no sufficiently safe context to say it. And what changes everything, when that context is built by those who have a reason to want it to exist. The room became quiet in a way that was not empty, but full of recognition of the type that happens when a statement describes with precision something that was present but had not yet been named. There was in her speech something that was not abstract or theoretical, and the people present were experienced enough to feel the difference. Afterward, in the corridor, the professor approached carefully and said it would be very valuable for the research corps' work if Mariana would consider participating in some more continuous way at some future point, when and if she felt it was the right time. Mariana said it was a real possibility, and it indeed was. There was an idea taking shape for a few weeks, still without sufficiently defined contours to be described in detail, but with a direction that was clear: to use what she had learned, about how isolation works as a mechanism, about how silence forms and how it undoes itself, about what is necessary for people who have something to say to find the context to say it, in a way that reached people before they needed to reach the point where she had reached. Patricia Alencar had resumed her consultancy in Florianopolis with a significantly higher demand than she had before, which she attributed to nothing in particular publicly, but which was clearly correlated with the profile she had built throughout the process. Some of the people who sought her were professionals, who arrived with specific and similar questions, how to identify work environments that function by dynamics similar to those she had described, how to document experiences so that they can be used before time makes documentation impossible, how to find support structures that do not require isolation as a condition for remaining where one is. Vera Esteves had returned to Brasilia and had resumed her tax practice with a difference she herself described in a message sent to Mariana on a Saturday morning, with the economic precision of someone choosing words like advocacy, knowing better what to accept and what not to accept. It was a simple phrase with a lot inside it, and it was sufficient for that very reason. Solange had begun to write. Not a formal testimony, not a public denunciation, not anything with a specific recipient. A series of texts on the recovery of professional and personal identity after situations of forced removal and systematic isolation. She was not sure yet if she would publish them in any format or for any audience. But writing had done something she had not anticipated when she began. It had given concrete form to things that had existed only as diffuse sensations for 12 years, like volumes in space without a defined outline. When you put it into words, she had told Mariana in a Sunday afternoon call, it stops being only yours. It becomes something that can be recognized by another person who has not yet found the words for what is theirs. Hector Villarreal had won the 2 contracts that were in direct dispute with the Grupo Asunción, and that had been paralyzed during the investigation period. He had called Mariana to inform her, with the brevity that was his specific way of expressing something he would not express otherwise. She had thanked him without effusion. The alliance had fulfilled what it needed to fulfill for both sides. What each of the parties took from then on was entirely the responsibility of each. Beatriz Tanaka had sent Mariana, without comment and without context beyond the link itself, the address of a recent academic article on the admissibility of collective testimonies in business and corporate investigation processes. Mariana read the article twice, made notes in the digital margins, and then thought about writing a written response. She ended up calling, because there were things the text did not carry, as well as the voice. The 2 talked for an hour about law, about methodology, about the necessarily imperfect space between what laws provide when they are written and what real situations demand when they arrive. It was the type of conversation that has no definitive closure, that does not need a resolution to have value, that can be resumed at any point without loss of continuity. It was the type of conversation that would continue. On the afternoon she left the FGV auditorium, Mariana walked along Rua Itapeva with the step of someone not in a hurry to get anywhere specific, until Trianon Park. She sat on a wooden bench that was slightly damp from the morning dew still retained by the shadow, and stood looking at the trees for a time, without thinking about anything specific, without making any calculation, without building any sequence for what would come next. São Paulo continued around her, with its continuous noise and its speed that never completely stops, and its particular indifference that is not coldness, but the necessary indifference of an organism too massive to pay individual attention to each of its millions of components. She had left a court in silence just over 8 months ago. At that moment, sitting on the bench with the park around her, the silence that surrounded her was completely different in quality, in texture, in weight. It was not the silence of someone guarding something that cannot yet be said. It was not the strategic silence she had built and sustained for months, with precision and effort. It was the silence of someone who has arrived at a place and can, finally, just be there without being there requiring anything in particular. She stayed on the bench for 20 more minutes, letting the city noise be what it was, without needing to do anything with it. Then she stood up, adjusted the bag on her shoulder, with the gesture of someone ready for the next stretch of the path, and returned to the busy avenue. There was much work ahead, much to build, much to discover about what was possible to do with what she had learned. And for the first time in a long time, that seemed like an open possibility and not a burden to be carried. End of story. If you have reached this far, you know. This story is not about revenge. It is about the moment a woman decides that silence has served its purpose and that now it is time to speak, and about what happens when other women realize they do not need to speak alone. If the trajectory of Mariana, Solange, Patricia, and Vera touched something in you, if you recognized in them something that belongs also to your own story or to that of someone you know. Leave in the comments what remains. Each word you write tells us that this story mattered, and that is what makes us continue bringing narratives like this, week after week, with the care they deserve. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, this is the moment. Not because we need the numbers, but because each person who arrives here chooses to listen to stories about courage, reconstruction, and what happens when people decide that silence has come to an end. And if you know someone who needs to hear exactly this right now, share it without hesitation. We will meet in the next episode.